what does it actually mean when we say democracy's on the line? Our guest, Nisha Anand, the CEO of Dream.org, would know. She was arrested for passing out pro-democracy leaflets in Myanmar in 1998. To help us unpack the state of democracy today and what we can learn from it, Myanmar and other places, Nisha will discuss her path from her 1998 arrest to seeking more bipartisanship today. I'm Dr. Kathleen McInnes, and this is Smart Women, Smart Power.
This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women.
I am so thrilled to have you on the podcast today. You're a CEO, you're an activist, a leader for racial justice, and a mom of 2 teenagers. I mean, that's a lot.
Many hats.
Many hats. So I can't wait to get into the incredible work you're doing, but also your views, again, on like the central question before our societies, and I would argue the world today. It's the state of democracy and whether we can hold the line against authoritarians. Right? But first, I'd love to know what drew you to this particular field. What inspired your work in this space?
I was always a little bit of a rabble rouser. I think that I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. It was a very black and white town, and my parents were Indian immigrants, and I was just the oddball out in the 80s getting raised in Atlanta. I never quite fit in anywhere. And so I clung to that identity. I liked that identity. And one of the things that it made me think about not fitting in was not fitting into, I guess, my family expectations of me.
Interesting.
My dad, coming from India, the gender roles are very well defined. Obviously, we live in, well, maybe not obviously, but I grew up thinking we live in a patriarchal culture here, but it is very different in India. The roles are very defined. And so I felt growing up that my job was to learn how to make great tea and marry wealthy and be pretty. That was what I felt were the expectations growing up. And I knew I wanted to break that mold. So already a misfit, I was going to rebel against that, against that kind of mold. And I rebelled hard. I was a young student activist. One of my first protests I tell people was in high school when I stopped shaving my legs, and I got called into the disciplinarian's office because we had uniforms. And she told me that it was unhygienic. Some boys didn't like how it looked, and I needed to shave my legs.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, imagine what that did for me. I then organized everybody else to also stop shaving their legs. So when I think about what started it is so many different circumstances. I think I guess I always had that nature that I wanted something better. I wanted something different. I always thought I have to lead this life of consequence so I can break the mold and help break the mold for other people. I can see that now looking back. I'm not sure then my understanding of it, but that activist spark, that feeling of the power that you can make some change. I think the change went backwards. They ended up specifying in the handbook at school that, certain different things like shaving your legs. So, but just knowing that I had that power to make change, that I had the power for my own life to make change.
Well, and also an intrinsic sense of the kind of change you want to see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I felt left out and left behind quite often, not fitting in either world. And I knew that I didn't want that for anyone else. And I have had that fight for the underdog, that desire to make sure that the future that I'm creating works for everybody. That's always been a part of who I am. And it's taken different forms throughout my life. And that's where I am now. After years of activism, college activism was when I also was arrested in Myanmar. And thinking about that right now, what's going on today? We didn't plan this, but
I think I was an intern on Capitol Hill, and we were looking at Myanmar and Aung San Suu Kyi and all these things. So I'm reading about this and hearing about this and how brutal the junta was, and you are there.
I am there.
How did that happen?
Yeah, I was a young college activist. I went to American University here in DC, and I was very active on campus. Pretty much any cause that felt righteous and that had, some of that underdog sentiment, I was there for. And one of the really active groups on campus was the Free Burma Coalition. And there were other activists that were running it, and they said, hey, we're going to organize this trip to Burma, the Thai-Burma border, and we're going to, go to Bangkok and meet some of the activists and some of the refugees, and you should come. And I said, of course, sign me up. And we went there really just to listen and learn and talk to some people who have been refugees for 10 years or more. And one of the people we met there is a woman named Debbie Stothard. She runs an organization called ASEAN. It's an organization that tries to put pressure on the ASEAN nations to change the human rights situation in Burma. And she was arranging an international protest. There were 18 activists from around the world. And she asked if we Americans could go, knowing that Americans have a different type of credibility. We went with Indonesians, Australians, Thai nationals. I can't remember everyone that went with us, but it was a group of people. It was 1998. And I said, sign me up. I was already a dozen arrests under my belt for civil disobedience in college. And I thought, this is an important cause. I had already been traveling around the border. I knew how horrific the military junta was. And there's also that, hubris that you only have when you're young. And you think you have to join the right fight. You have to do the right thing. And that's why I'm really inspired by young activists today too, because they have that. They'll speak out. They're not worried about the consequences. And yes, I look back now and think I could have been killed. It was a little bit naive, like looking back at what happened then. But I'm also really thankful for those folks that will speak out and do the right thing. And so at that point in my life, I was 21 years old and I said yes. And I went into Burma with 18 other internationals. We smuggled these business card size leaflets. And all it said was, we are your friends from around the world. We support your hopes for human rights and democracy. That's all it said. Wow. But in 98, it was highly illegal. There was no internet. There was no outside media. There were no newspapers it was very much a lockdown, authoritarian. I mean, it had been run by the military for quite a while. And we went in on the 10-year anniversary of the uprising of 88. Now just seeing through history how many times they've had these massive uprisings, followed by an agreement for democracy, followed by a military crackdown. Now this has happened 3 times since then in Myanmar. But in 98, it was 10 years after, it's going to be this big moment. And we thought we were going to hand out these leaflets. We had it well planned. We all had a flight out. We were going to somehow get out. We're going to land back in Thailand, big press conference, but all 18 of us were arrested in our different locations. So I was with a group of 3 Americans and we were all arrested. None of us made it out of the country. And
so let's break. That's a thing.
Yes.
To be arrested by a military junta.
Yeah.
At that time, I mean, at any time, I guess. But what were you in prison? We had the embassy engaged. What had to happen to get you out of the country?
Yes. So when we were first arrested, I knew, that youth, I thought, I can't show fear. I don't know how terrified I actually was. It was the first time I saw a fax, because that's how people communicated back then. There was a fax from all our friends around the world. And one was from my father. And I saw, he's like, please stay safe. And that was the first moment I thought, what have I done?
Right.
We found out it was an international news story. It was the headline everywhere. And my father is just sitting there across the country worried about me. So I didn't feel fear at first. I didn't know all 18 of us had been arrested. I had been arrested with just my group of 3. I think within the first maybe 6 days was the first time we saw a representative from the U.S. Embassy. Back then, the U.S. had downgraded the diplomatic relations. They didn't have an ambassador.
Okay.
And so the U.S. pressure for us to have U.S. citizens as part of that action, our pressure was really for the international media aspect of it. We didn't have a lot of economic interests at that time. So we were dependent on Thailand or Indonesia to put some of that economic pressure with those arrests. And it was quite a scary situation because I heard nothing for 6 days. Wow. And then when they would take us to the bathroom, we'd catch a glimpse of some of the other people that we had been arrested with and eventually found out everyone is here. All 18 of us had been picked up.
So if we could, I'd love to, love is the wrong word, but I think it would be useful to walk a little bit more in your shoes in that time. And the reason I say this is because it does feel to me that when we think about countering authoritarian regimes and promoting democracy, we sometimes forget what authoritarian regimes are capable of doing and do today. So what was it like? And how long were you there?
Yeah. So I look like I could be Burmese because there are so many different ethnicities in there. And so I was arrested with 2 other white Americans. And when we were arrested, I was slapped across the face. The other folks weren't. And I was shoved and pushed. And I didn't realize that it was happening to me, but it seemed like to them, there are so many people that are resistant, that are part of the resistance to the military junta. So we kept getting information from some of the different guards that were with us. And they said that they thought that I was a Burmese citizen leading them around to do this protest. So my punishment could have been death. They could have shot then and asked questions later. They had certainly killed about 10,000 people in 1988. I think the current statistics, and for folks that don't know, in 2021, there was an election, giant Democrat win for the National Democratic Party, and the military junta on February 1st, when they were supposed to certify the results, took over the Capitol, and it's been a civil war ever since. This time around, I think it's 30,000 people have been killed. At this point, I think 8,000 just civilians. And really, anyone that's fighting against the junta is a civilian. They're part of a different resistance movement. So there was definitely that, now that I look back on it. I had a friend who was arrested, if you remember the Iran hikers, and they spent a year in jail.
Right.
So it could have been that for us. But I spent 8 days, and on the 8th day, they put all of us in a van and carted us off to a trial. And it was all conducted in Burmese, so we didn't understand a word of it until the very end of the day. It was like a 12-hour day. They said 5 years hard labor. That was the only words in English that was spoken. And that there were cameras there because they wanted to show the world they were having a trial. And I remember all of us just trying to keep a straight face, but I thought, oh my God, I'm going to spend 5 years here. And at that point, we hadn't been taken to prison. We were in government officials' offices. And this is true, the prison that's in the capital city is called Insane Prison. We were not kept in Insane. We were in government offices. So I thought, am I going to go to Insane? Which used to be where the guard dogs for the British colonialists were kept. So that's where most political prisoners go. Wow, all of this is coming back to me. I haven't told this story in so long, but all of this, digging in, I'm just remembering a lot of it. But as we were walking out that night after the trial, one of the guards said, "You're going to be deported tomorrow."
Wow.
So that night, we all were kept for the first time all together in a guest house. The U.S. government bought us several cases of Sam Adams beer and brought it to the guest house we were staying. That was my first time drinking. I was 21 or almost 21. I was around 21.
At that point, you deserved it.
Yes, but I thought if the U.S. government's going to bring me beer, we'll have
beer. You're gonna have beer.
Yeah. So that felt great. And a lot of the guards were celebrating with us. And that was a huge catalyst for my career because then I had to speak about Myanmar a lot of different places as a young activist. But it was a huge catalyst for my way of thinking because the one person from the United States that flew all the way out to Myanmar, and we were 4 students from American University. So they were certainly worried about their 4 AU students on a student trip for the Free Burma Coalition that have gotten arrested in a foreign country. But the person who flew out to get us was Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, Republican in Congress. And I thought, I'm a rabble rouser. I am a lefty. I am like on the streets, locking myself to buildings. Like, I'm going to have some words with this representative on our way back. That was my thinking. Like, maybe I can change his mind. I'd always thought back then of power as a fight the power type of feeling. And so sitting next to him on the plane, I had a laundry list of things that I was going to change his mind about.
Wait, hang on a second. You've just gotten released from prison.
Yes. You're getting a very good look of me as a teenager. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Let's keep going.
Yes. So I thought, this is my moment.
Yeah. Okay.
And we sat down on this plane and he immediately started talking about the human rights situation, why he was so passionate about Myanmar and their desire for democracy and how we shared that. And then he shifted to several other places where we had similar feelings. He was the head of the Human Rights Commission at that point, and he cared about human rights internationally from a very authentic place. We might not agree on how to solve it. We might not agree on why it exists, but we wanted the same outcome. Definitely the ends of like these human rights abuses have to stop. We had a great conversation. I didn't challenge him on almost anything that I can remember. What I thought of was there are people in power from a different side of the aisle as me, somebody that I thought was like the man or the enemy back then, that share some of my goals. And what could that kind of partnership look like? What could we actually accomplish? Up until that point, I was always on the outside fighting. I was always thinking of these big corporations. And one of my first arrests, I locked myself to the center ring at the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to protest animal abuse. Like, that wasn't necessarily the most effective. When I think back now, I'm like, if I wanted them to stop abusing animals, what was that going to accomplish? That I definitely remember sitting in the ring thinking, I've ruined, it was here in DC actually. And I thought, I ruined all of these children's nights because I'm locked here by the neck to like 6 other activists. So certainly,
There's so much to process.
Yes.
So much to process. Okay.
Lots of stories there. Yeah.
But it's true. To make real progress on an issue, you need to have broad consensus, a broad group of stakeholders, and in fact, it's, you know, a broad majority of people tend to agree on at least 50% of an issue.
Yes.
Arguments tend to happen on the margins.
Yes.
I mean,
absolutely. And that's what democracy is supposed to be at its most purest form, is that ability for different voices to come to the table and hear each other and understand each other and realize we might have different perspectives, but let's see what we share in common. That is what it should be. And we've gotten so far away from that. Like you said, on the margins, it's more of a perception gap because most of America actually wants such similar things. They just think the other side doesn't, or the other side thinks I'm evil, or I'm this, or they're calling me this, or the perception of what folks thinks is worse than what's actually there. And that is a democracy destroyer.
Yeah. Well, how do we counteract that? Right? How do we build those coalitions given the extremity and the volume of the voices on the periphery that are arguably trying to tear us apart?
Yes. It has to start individually. I mean, we need things in big ways. We absolutely need our policymakers to work together and model it. That is true. But I think for us individually, we have to be willing to have some uncomfortable conversations. We have to be willing to show up authentically ourselves and let someone else show up authentically themselves and have difficult conversations. Talk about what divides us. And don't think that means they hate me and don't want me to exist just because we have a difference in opinion. And we don't want to do that. We're not talking to our own family members who happen to vote a different way than we voted. And that is the least. I mean, like we started talking about, I was arrested in a military dictatorship. I know what it looks like when all democracy is lost. Somebody who votes differently than you is not evil. I've seen evil. We know what that looks like. And if we start making someone who votes differently the other, we will start feeling able to kill the other. That's what has happened in military dictatorships, authoritarian regimes for quite a while. So us being able to connect, model it for our children, model it for our neighbors, model it for our schools, whatever system you're a part of, model that. I think there are these big companies that sometimes ask, they're like, we don't talk about politics. We're really nervous because we know people feel differently. And they asked me to come talk about it at the office. And I'm like, you've got to talk about it.
Yeah.
The hard conversations are important. And that's what I see happening on college campuses right now is it's people are saying you shouldn't or you should. And it's not that. That's the conversation. That's the richness of democracy. Let's listen. Let's listen hard. And
well, and it's like in any relationship, right? If you don't ventilate the issues and have those hard conversations, all you're doing is punting the problem. And usually in punting the problem, it makes it worse.
Right. Got to let the valve out.
Right. And democracy, it's not a one and done kind of thing. Democracy is conversation.
It is conversation. And I think it's always evolving. I think democracy is freedom. And if we haven't gotten there yet. This democracy isn't perfect. I think we're still fighting for more representative democracy. But I've always wanted to get us there. I've wanted to get us closer to that path of freedom. You know, you still see that in me, right? I'm like that young, I know we're going to get there. And so I will work with absolutely anybody to make the future work for everyone. And I want to model that. So yes, I think it starts locally, but what we do at dream.org is show that it can work at scale. So we try to take big problem sets like criminal justice reform and climate. When we started working on criminal justice reform, Everyone told us it was not a bipartisan issue. They thought it was an oxymoron to say bipartisan criminal justice reform. But we said, let's try it. We had enough in common to try it. And together we helped pass the First Step Back in Congress. We started working on it under the Obama administration, kept working on it despite protests during the Trump administration, got the bill signed, and not just a little bit bipartisanship. 89 senators in a Republican-controlled Congress voted for this bill. 30,000 people are home from prison today because we passed that bill. So I know it can work at scale. Mm-hmm. Of course, I will always tell you, have the conversation with the uncle who voted differently than you. But I also want to show the world it works at scale. It can work, and that's what democracy should look like. But in an election year, there's so little willpower to do things together. But that's when we really need to show it. We really need to show that there is hope, that it's not over. I think there's a lot of like, let's just forget about the experiment.
That's such a powerful message, right? Because it's in the day-to-day, in the everyday, we sort of, it's hard to see how our conversations with our family can connect to this bigger picture stuff. Or here in DC, sometimes it's hard to see how these big picture questions and issues can impact individual. It's just the disconnects are so easy to settle into.
Yes.
And sort of not think about as a result. And so that's just, again, just a comment that what you've just articulated and what you're doing through dream.org is really quite inspiring.
Thank you.
You know, like,
I think so. It's why I love working there. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I was just thinking, you said that word, we settle into, the way you said that, it really hit me because it reminded me that is exactly what we learn about dehumanization is once you settle into it's that way, or that person is this way, and that makes.
Yeah. You get into this rut.
Yeah.
Right. And then, but again, part of the conversation, part of democracy is to continuously force ourselves out of the rut. Yeah. And ruts are comfortable. Comfort zones are comfortable. But comfort zones are often, like psychologically speaking, a bad place to be.
Exactly, right? Mm-hmm. We're always told, push outside your comfort zone. We've mixed up the idea of physical safety for psychological safety or intellectual safety. And there's this idea like, oh, this should be a safe space. I shouldn't feel challenged. That's not what it's about. I want you to always be physically safe. I do not want you to put yourself in danger. And there are some conversations that do feel dangerous. Don't jump into those. Definitely, I'm not telling people to go someplace dangerous.
Right.
But if you can push your thinking, if you could be uncomfortable, if you can embrace, I don't know, and I might be wrong, those conversations move you more than any other ones. But folks are like, I can't, it's not safe. You know, that person uses this word. It's like, let him use that word. Like, let him use that word and try to understand it. You know, it's.
Yeah. So reflecting on all of these experiences and your approach to leadership, do you think that your gender as a woman has had an impact on that approach and these decisions? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Absolutely. Unequivocally, yes, it has had a major impact. Like I told you, I grew up thinking that, you know, my brother was going to inherit the family business and I was going to marry well. And in India, women go off with their husband's family at time of marriage. And, you know, my brother had an arranged marriage and I didn't. It was definitely one of the rebellious things. And so I always knew that my decision-making wasn't counter to that. It was very outside the box for the body I was born into. And I had to break that mold pretty hard for my family to follow. They're very supportive. My dad is very proud of everything I've done, even though he is a very different politically. He voted for Trump twice. He is a Republican. He's like a new immigrant Republican. We do not share a lot of the same values that way, but he's very proud of what I do. I broke the mold. I think that decisions in leadership where it's brought me is I have the same self-doubt that a lot of women have, imposter syndrome, and who am I to tell people this or that? I have all of that same, it still exists no matter how far along in your career.
Ain't that the truth?
Right?
Right? Like, it's this is a digression. It's exhausting.
It's exhausting. But that does impact decision-making. And sometimes that's a deep, I wonder if when we question ourselves, who am I to say that? It's actually giving us some empathy for when we do make the decision. we might be able to communicate it in a better way. Maybe I'm trying to reverse it on its head in the moment with you. But I do think in terms of my leadership style, that's a part of it.
Yeah. Sure.
That I have that deep empathy for what everyone else is going through. And I do see different values. And I've often said our organization has feminist leadership. I don't shy away from that word. It's impossible to be. I was raised when feminist wasn't a bad word. It was a great word. And I think of myself as a feminist, and there's no way to be a feminist as a CEO of a big national nonprofit organization and not have that be part of the leadership style.
Right.
So I embrace it fully. And I don't know how all of my staff and all the multi-generational feel about that, but you'll see it reflected. We are 70% women. We are 70% people of color. It's who you have in power changes the dynamic of who's in the organization. So I think absolutely impacts every level of my decision-making. And I think that's a good thing.
And to conclude our conversation, I'm interested in your thoughts. What is power?
Yes. Well, I've had a very complicated relationship to power over the years. I definitely thought as a young activist, like power was bad, power corrupts, anyone with power is my enemy. I was fight the power. I was on the streets, like I said, arrested a dozen times. And I even led a conference on civil disobedience back as a college activist. It was like, I have to question all power. And through my learnings, I realized that it's not the power part that's bad. I've always also loved people power. That's why I was an activist, is I think everyone who has a voice, if I hear from all the people, what power that is, that gives me so much information. If you have people power, that's what's changed the world. So I also loved that version of power my whole life. And really looking at how those always have played off of each other just throughout history is what's really beautiful. So I actually sometimes I talk about power redistribution. And it's not that we have to be averse to having power. We have to think about how do we make sure power is for everyone. Yeah. And that's what democracy is, right? It's every single person being able to have that freedom to help. I think of democracy as more the collective versus this individual freedom. And I think that is what power is when we can actually make the world a better place for everybody. That's the power I want.
Nisha, thank you so much for joining us and for an inspiring and eye-opening conversation.